Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Madeline from Knitting House Square and today I have an Afterthought heel tutorial for you. So if you're joining for my other toe-up sock tutorial, welcome. We are here to knit the Afterthought heel, and what I'm going to be taking you through in this video is essentially how to place the waste yarn. I do use waste yarn when I'm doing Afterthought heels. So we're going to place our waste yarn, then knit up the rest of our sock. Then once our sock is complete, we're going to come back to that waste yarn, pick up the stitches on either sides, work through all the decreases using magic loop, then lastly do a Kitchener stitch bind off. So that is all the steps I'm taking you through in this video. I'll have all the supplies that I use, and all this yarn and supplies was kindly provided by Hobbii yarns, so thank you Hobbii. I'll have it all linked down below in the description box if you have any questions about it. And also I'll have a written version of this pattern. That way if you have different stitch counts than me, or if you're trying to figure out any of the different components, there's a free PDF download available in the description box below. So let's get started. Real quick, all the different materials I'm using for this project is, first up, for my main colorway, what I knit these socks out of is called Silly Socks by Hobbii Yarns. Then my contrasting color that I'm going to be using for my heel is the Rainbow 4-ply sock wool in the cream colorway. And these are both fingering weight or sock weight yarns. Lastly, in terms of my knitting needle, I'm using the same knitting needle that I used for Magic Loop on my socks. So these are the Knit Pro Basics, and it's about a 40-inch cord that I have there. The one final thing you'll need is a tapestry needle to work the Kitchener stitch bind off. So for these socks, I start at the toe and I knit all the way up through the foot, leaving about 2 inches up here at the top, extra space for where I'm going to put in the heel. So this is now going to become the row where I put in my waste yarn. So for the waste yarn, you want to pick a yarn that's the same weight as the other yarn you're knitting, or a little bit of a lighter weight. So this is, again, just some more sock yarn. And you want to pick a contrasting color, so something that isn't going to blend in with your work, a color that you can pick out really easily. Last thing to note is that if one of the sides of your sock has a pattern, so if you have like a top and a bottom side to your sock, you just want to make sure you're doing this across the bottom side of your sock. For my sock here, both sides are just plain stockinette, so I can just do it across either side of my stitches. So what I'm going to be doing here is, first, I'm going to begin knitting my next stitch just as I regularly would, so put my knitting needle in. Now instead of knitting with the yarn I was just working with, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to pick up my contrasting color, just leave about a 6 to 8 inch tail here. I'm going to wrap that one around my knitting needle and knit with this yarn. Now I'm going to continue knitting across half of my total number of stitches. So I knit my socks using Magic Loop, so I have my first half on one knitting needle, my second half on the second knitting needle. So I'm going to knit across this full first knitting needle using this contrasting color. And another thing to note here too, is you want to make sure you're knitting all the stitches. Even if you had a pattern on your sock or anything like that, you want to just knit all these stitches because we are going to be removing this waste yarn that we're putting in later on. Now that I finished going across the first half of my stitches, only the first half, I didn't work the second half, I'm not going to turn my work. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm now going to pass each one of these stitches back over to my left knitting needle. And I'm just going into the back of each one of these stitches so I don't twist it. Okay, now I've gone all the way back across. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to cut this waste yarn tail so that it isn't quite as long. Again, on this side where it's joined to my ball of yarn, I don't need a very long tail, just 6 to 8 inches. And now I'm going to tuck each one of those tails into the inside of my sock so that they don't get in the way and I don't accidentally start knitting with them or anything like that. Now I can set back up for Magic Loop. Now when I look at my work, I have waste yarn on my front knitting needle, or the first half of my stitches. Then I just have my other regular sock yarn on the other half of the stitches. So what I'm going to begin knitting next is actually going to become the leg of the sock. So if you have any pattern that you're introducing into the leg, right, if you want the whole leg of the sock to be a certain type of ribbing, this is the round where you're going to want to begin that. So for me, again, I'm just going to continue working stockinette all the way up through the leg of the sock. So I'm going to continue working all the way up for the rest of the sock pattern. Then once I finish and cast off, then I'll come back and I'll show you how to come back down and pick up that heel. So now that we've placed our waist yarn, what you actually need to do is just continue knitting all the way up through the sock. So if you've never knit all the way up through the cuff, and then the ribbing, and lastly, if you want to do a really stretchy cast off, you can do Jenny's surprisingly stretchy bind off. If you've never done any of those steps below, I do have a full tutorial available out now, which is a full toe-up sock tutorial. So you could just start towards the second half there and learn how to finish up your socks. Once we've finished up the socks, we'll come back and we'll pick up those heel stitches and work the heel. So now I've just finished knitting the main portion of my sock, and I've come back now and I'm going to knit the heel. So the way I have the sock placed in front of me is with essentially the place I started knitting closest to me and then where I cast off furthest away. So these ones were toe-up socks, so the toe is closer to me. Now the way this is going to work is we're going to use the exact same knitting needle that we used to knit these socks. So I used a circular knitting needle here. And first we're going to take one of the points and we're going to pick up the first half of the stitches going from right to left. Then we're going to turn our work and we're going to pick up the second half of the stitches, again, going from right to left. So looking at these stitches, where we want to start is over here on the right side. And you got to find that first full V in the waist yarn. So mine always likes to curl a little bit. So I'm gonna just push this up a little bit. So that first full V is my first stitch. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take one of my knitting needle points and I'm gonna pick up the stitch just below it, only the right side of it, right? So I have the V in the waist yarn and then right below it, there's a V in pink yarn. I'm gonna pick up just the right side of that V. Now next up we have another V. So again, I'm going to go right below it and pick up just the right side of that one. And I'm going to keep on doing this all the way across this side. Okay, so now I've gone all the way across, so I'm going to slide these a little further onto my knitting needle so I don't lose any of them. Now I'm going to go back across and I'm going to count to make sure I have the right number. So for my heel, I'm using half of my total number of stitches. So I have a total of 68 stitches, so I should have 34 stitches going right across here. That's perfect. That's exactly what I have. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this knitting needle and I'm going to pull it towards the left so that these stitches end up on the cord. And I'm going to pull it fairly far just so I have plenty of cord to work with over here. And this one's a little bit closer to the opposite knitting needle point. Now I'm going to flip my work around about 180 degrees here. And now I'm going to go along this edge and pick up each one of these stitches. But there's a bit of a catch here. So again, as we work across this side, we're going to be looking for each one of these V's, and we want to pick up the right side just below each one of those. But what you're going to notice, if it actually starts off with kind of like a half of a V, so here's one bar going from left down towards the right, we're just going to ignore that, and we're going to skip right to this first full V, and now I'm going to pick up the right side right below that first V, then I'm going to pick up the right side below that next one and keep on going all the way across this side. And then you just want to make sure that you get that last right half of a V there all the way at the end. Now I'm going to slide those onto my knitting needle again, just so that I don't lose them. And now again, I'm going to check to make sure I have the number of stitches that I should. Okay, perfect. So I do have those 34 stitches. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this other knitting needle over towards the left. So now both halves of my stitches are just on the cord. That makes it a little bit easier for me to unravel some of this waste yarn in the middle to make sure that I didn't lose any stitches along the way. So you can start at either side here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take, you can take a knitting needle point or a tapestry needle, anything like that, and you just want to unravel just a little bit of this yarn at the inner corner. Okay, so I just did this first side, and now what I'm looking for is I want to make sure that I didn't miss any stitches. So you can see here, this one stitch does look really large. I'm thinking though that that is just because, yep, that's where I joined yarn. So it makes sense that that one's very large. Okay, so that all looks good. And then over here on the pink side, I have caught all of those stitches, so there's nothing about to unravel. Now let's go to the other side. Now when I look in this inner corner, again, I've caught all of those stitches and nothing's about to unravel. So here, if you do see something about to unravel in one of those two corners, what you want to do is you want to pick it up, either mark it with a stitch marker, something like that, something to hold it in place. So then when you begin working that full round, you can incorporate that stitch into the heel and it doesn't get lost along the way. So now that I've verified that I have caught all the stitches, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take out my full piece of waste yarn. So I find it's easier if I cut it down as I go. That way I don't have to drag like a full piece of yarn out each time. So I just unravel a little bit, then cut it again. Now I've completely removed my waste yarn and I'm ready to knit my first round of the heel. The way we're going to do this is first we're going to place our work so that our knitting needle points are going over towards the right. And then I'm going to slide them each back in so that the work or all the stitches are back on the knitting needles. Now we're going to knit this heel using magic loop. So to knit one round in magic loop, we first have to knit across the front knitting needle, or the one closest to us, all of those stitches. Then we're going to turn our work and knit all the way across the back knitting needle, which is the one further away from us. So first up, I have to join my yarn. So I'm just going to take a short tail, about 8 inches or so, and I'm going to thread it to the inside of my work. Now in this first round, we're going to pick up some stitches on either side. That way we close up any holes that are trying to form. So first up, we're going to pick up one stitch on this first corner, knit all the way across our front knitting needle, then pick up one stitch on the other corner, turn our work, again pick up one stitch from this corner, knit all the way across, then pick up one remaining stitch over here from this corner. So in total, we're going to be picking up 4 stitches. So to begin, I'm going to take my back knitting needle, or the one furthest away from me. I'm going to pull it towards the right so that those back stitches end up on the cord. Now first up, I want to pick up a stitch from this inner corner. So I look for the topmost one. So I'm going to go for this topmost pink one here. Put that one on my left knitting needle, then knit it using my new yarn. Now I'm going to continue knitting all the way across. Now before I turn my work to begin knitting across the second side, I'm first going to pick up a stitch from this inner corner. So I'm going to pick up this topmost bar here. Then I'm going to knit it through the back loop just to tighten it up a bit. Now that we knit all the way across that front knitting needle, we need to turn our work. So again, our knitting needle point is going over towards the right, and thread back in our second knitting needle point. Now again, on this side, we're gonna do the exact same thing where we pick up one stitch, knit all the way across, then pick up one stitch at the end. And to begin, I'm gonna take my back knitting needle, I'm gonna pull it towards the right. Now on this side, kind of like I did on the first portion of the first half, is I'm gonna pick up that full stitch there, put it right on my knitting needle, and then knit it, making sure I pull that first stitch nice and tight. Now I'm gonna continue knitting all the way across. Knit the final stitch. And now before I turn my work, again, I'm gonna pick up one stitch. So again, I'm actually gonna go with the topmost bar here. It looks a little bit loose right now. That's because I joined an extra color there. But once I weave in that end, it'll tighten up. So I'm gonna go for that bar again and knit it through the back. So now that I've finished going all the way across the second half of my stitches, I can now turn my work again. So now before we begin working the decrease rounds and continuing up through the heel, we need to do a little bit of math. So the first thing to do is recount the number of stitches that you have going across just one of your knitting needles. When you do this, you should have half of your total number of stitches plus 2 for those 2 extra we added on. So in my case, I end up with 34 stitches plus the 2 cast on, or a total of 36 stitches. Now those 36 stitches, I need to divide between 3 different sections. And the reason I need to divide between 3 different sections is because the way a heel is worked is essentially we start off with our total number of stitches, or this would be like my 36 stitches. Then we're gonna decrease in on each side. And then lastly, we're gonna be left with a certain number of stitches in the center that we're gonna do a Kitchener stitch bind off for. So we need to decide how many stitches we want left up there in the center. So I like to think of this as dividing it into 3 equal portions. Now, if I take my total number of stitches on one knitting needle now, or 36, and I divide it by 3, I'm gonna end up with exactly 12 stitches in each one of these segments. Now, anytime I'm doing one of these decreases in the first component, right, I want all of these to be left-leaning decreases. So those are all gonna be slip-slip knits. Now, anytime I'm doing one of these component or the decreases over here in like the third component, these are all right-leaning decreases. So those are all gonna be knit 2 togethers. Now you'll notice here that my stitches worked out perfectly, right? So it was evenly divisible by 3. Let's say it wasn't, right? So if it wasn't, let's say instead maybe you started off with 32 stitches, then you added on 2 from the cast on, so you had 34 stitches total. All you need to do then is again, figure out how many times 3 goes into this number evenly. So if I divide this by 3, I get 11 with a remainder of 1. So I'm gonna put 11 in each one of these sides, and then I'm gonna do 11 plus that remainder in the center portion. So really I'll have 12 stitches there remaining in the center. Now if instead you had a remainder of 2, right, you're just gonna put the even numbers, or whatever is evenly divisible in either of those side ones, then add on your remainder of 2 to that center portion. So these are the numbers I'm working with here. So that's what I'm going to be following along with as I'm working through my heel. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to knit our first stitch. Then we're going to work our first decrease. Now the first decrease we need to work is a slip-slip knit. So the way this works is first we're going to twist each one of the next 2 stitches. So I'm going to slip the first stitch as if I'm knitting it. Then I'm going to slip the second stitch as if I'm knitting it as well. Now I'm going to take my left knitting needle point and I want to go into the front base of both of those stitches. So now I have my left knitting needle in front of my right knitting needle. Now I'm just going to wrap my yarn around as if I'm knitting it, pull that loop through, and slide them both off of my left knitting needle. So we just created a decrease that leans towards the left. Now I'm going to continue knitting all the way across this first knitting needle until 3 stitches remain. So now I have 3 stitches remaining. Now I'm going to work a knit 2 together. So I'm going to take my right knitting needle point into the base of the next 2 stitches at the same time, knitwise, wrap my yarn around, pull through, and slide both of them off. Now I just created a right leaning decrease. Then I'm going to knit the final stitch. Now I'm going to turn my work so my knitting needle points go back over towards the right, thread back in my second knitting needle. And again on this side, I now need to work those exact same decreases. So I'm going to pull my back knitting needle towards the right, still plenty of cord over there on the left. Knit the first stitch. Then I'm going to work a slip, slip, knit. So I'm going to slip the first stitch knitwise, so I'm twisting it. Then I'm going to slip the next stitch knitwise again, so I'm twisting them both. Taking that left knitting needle point, going into the front base of both of those stitches at the same time, wrapping my yarn around, pulling through. Knitting until 3 stitches remain. Now that 3 stitches remain, I'm going to work a knit 2 together. So right knitting needle point into the base of the next 2 stitches, wrap my yarn around, pull through, knit the final stitch. Now again, I'm going to turn my work, slide back in my second knitting needle. So to work that decrease round, right, first we worked all the way across the front knitting needle, then turned our work and worked all the way across the back knitting needle. After each one of these decrease rounds, you're going to want to knit one full round. So knit all the way across the front, then knit all the way across the back. And you're going to keep on alternating between those 2 rounds until in between each one of those decreases, you have whatever number you're looking for. So in my case, it's 12. So on my final round, I'll knit 1, work a slip, slip, knit, then knit 12, knit 2 together, knit the final stitch, turn my work, and repeat the same thing across the back side. So it's not when you have 12 stitches total, but when you have 12 stitches in between those 2 decreases. So once I come back and I finish that final decrease round, no need to do the final knit round after that. I'm just going to show you the Kitchener stitch at that point. So I've now finished going all the way up through all of my decreases. And so the number of stitches I have remaining, I have 12 in the center, then I have each one of my decreases, then the knit stitch on either side. So now what I have in front of me is I have a tapestry needle, and first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut my yarn. I always like to have extra, so probably about 18 inches here is where I'm going to cut it. Now I'm going to thread my tapestry needle with this yarn tail. And now we're going to do the Kitchener stitch bind off. So the way this works is there's a 2-stitch setup and then a 4-stitch repeat. So I'm going to show first the setup, then the repeat I'll probably show once or twice through, then I'll just put the written up steps up on the screen. They can also be found in the pattern down below. So when you begin, you want to make sure you have your working yarn coming down below your work, both your knitting needle points pointed over towards the right. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my tapestry needle through the first stitch on the front knitting needle, or the one closest to me, as if I'm purling it. Leave that stitch on the knitting needle. Now I want to go through the first stitch on the back knitting needle, or the one furthest away from me, as if I'm knitting it, and you'll notice I'm going underneath the front one. That's so I don't end up with any yarn overs or anything like that. So I'm going through that first stitch knitwise, leaving that stitch on the back knitting needle. So that was my setup. Now there's a 4 stitch or a 4 movement repeat. So first I'm going to go through the first stitch on the front knitting needle knitwise, and I'm going to slide that stitch off of the front knitting needle. Now I'm going to go through the new first stitch on the front knitting needle purlwise. I'm going to leave that stitch on the front knitting needle. Now I'm going to go through the first stitch on the back knitting needle purlwise. I'm going to slide that stitch off of the back knitting needle. And now I'm going to go through the new first stitch on the back knitting needle knitwise. Leave that stitch on the back knitting needle. Now whenever I finish, I just gently tug on it a bit too, just to close up those stitches that I just made. Now to show it one more time, first I'm going to go through the first stitch on the front knitting needle knitwise. Slide that stitch off of the front knitting needle. Now I'm going to go through the new first stitch on the front knitting needle purlwise. Leave that stitch on the front knitting needle. Now I'm going to go through the first stitch on the back knitting needle purlwise. Slide that stitch off of the back knitting needle. And now I'm going to go through the new first stitch on the back knitting needle knitwise. Leave that stitch on the back knitting needle. And then again, just gently pull on that strand of yarn, and we can see where it's starting to bind off all the stitches along that top edge. So now I'm going to continue repeating those 4 steps over and over again, all the way until I've binded off all the stitches. So towards the end, on the last 2 stitches, you won't be able to complete the full 4 steps. Just go through as many of the steps as you can, then thread the remaining tail through that final stitch. So I've now completed that Kitchener stitch across the top edge. At the end, I thread the tail through that final remaining stitch, and then I take that thread, weave it to the inside. And then for all of my ends, what I do is I just mirror existing stitches. So you can see down here in this corner of my heel, this is where I had a couple different yarn colors coming together. So I just follow along with an existing stitch matching that color. Then I cut little tiny short tails. For the one from Kitchener stitch, I weaved it in, going for almost about an inch there or so. Cut my yarn tail. And now, if you haven't done the same steps for the second sock, of course complete the second sock. Then the last thing I do is I soak my sock in some lukewarm water. Then I roll it up in a towel to get most of the moisture out. And then lastly, I lay it flat to dry. Thank you so much for joining me today as we work the Afterthought heel. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them down below. And if you're new to my channel, don't forget to hit that red subscribe button down below. That way you stay updated on all my new videos. I'll see you next time.